to anyone who's joining us online, just to remind everybody from Monday, this is a Think In with a twist. Very good, big, heavy, nigh on mandatory tortoise turnout for a very specific reason, which is that the idea is to address a subject that is not just in the news now, but is kind of a hardy perennial, always in the news, and really figure out, not just say that we want to figure out, or at least make some progress in what we think about it. But I initially feel a caveat in my head there. We don't write leaders, we don't write editorials, so that's just the start. That is the first step towards figuring out what we, as a rather different sort of newsroom, should be doing to report on immigration. How we avoid the dreaded let's do something on, how we fit the subject and the sort of subheadings within the subject to our formats. We do podcasts and we do sense makers. We broadly try to make sense of things, but we're also really on the lookout for human-driven narrative stories for podcasts and multi-part podcasts. So the other point I want to make at the top is that we have on the screen, welcome to how did small boats become such a big issue. We want to talk about more than that today. We want to try and answer that question, discuss who it's a big issue for and why, but also park small boats in a sense, compartmentalise it to try and figure out where they all fit in the much, much bigger picture of immigration post-Brexit, immigration as a driver of Brexit, the new immigration policy that the people who brought us Brexit have brought in now. I was just looking at it. And figure out whether in fact there are more interesting stories perhaps than small boats within that bigger picture that we should also be focusing on, that everyone else is ignoring. Okay, I've got a general knowledge question to start with. Who knows, and I admit here I'm relying on another secondary source, from where the biggest foreign-born group of immigrants in the UK now comes from? Go for it.
Albania.
Okay, so the offer was Albania. Amrit. Poland. Anyone else? Both wrong. Alice.
Sudan?
No.
Iran?
No.
India.
No.
China.
No.
Afghanistan.
No. Italy. Up markedly since Brexit, and the biggest single non-UK born group in London at the moment. Interesting, isn't it? So there's a lot that you wouldn't intuit. Anyway, I asked Barney to make some slides so that we could start with just some basic facts, or what we'll call facts, but if anyone who knows about immigration reckons that Barney's got some of it wrong, let's call him out. Do you want to just, can we get Barney a microphone so we can talk through that as a starter?
Yeah.
Thanks, Barney. Let's go.
So that's it there by the numbers. Near to 45,000 number of people who've crossed the channel in small boats in 2022, a 60% increase in the previous year. 72,000 number of asylum applications made in the UK up to September 2022. Net migration to the UK in the last year up to June 2022 was nearly 500,000. And 70% of asylum claims in the UK approved at the initial decision stage. In previous years, that has been quite a high number, but that is only because the Home Office has processed fewer claims than they have in previous years.
And that, just before we go on, that 504 number is very big compared with previous years, even years when Conservative governments were getting neuralgic about net migration, and is partly a result of Ukraine, partly a result of Hong Kong. Anyway, there are other factors as well.
If we can go to the next slide. So Jess spoke to someone, Dr. Peter William Walsh, senior researcher at the Migration Observatory, and he had that to say. So in terms of asylum applications, the number of kind of small boat asylum applications, if we're going to call them that, it is a smaller number than those from Ukraine and Hong Kong. But obviously there has been this focus within both politics and the media, of course, on the small boats issue. I'm sure we'll get onto the reasons why in a minute. The next slide. So in the EU, the UK ranks 7th in terms of total asylum requests granted in the 12 months to September 2022. And then next slide. So as I was saying before, last year the UK, in terms of applications approved at initial decision, was in the lead. But you could argue that's as a result of the Home Office actually processing so few claims. They only really did the claims that they thought were more likely to succeed.
Ah, didn't realise that.
Yeah. And then a bit on the law. So 70% of cases where failed asylum seekers challenge their removal from Britain are done so under Article 8 of the ECHR. This is something that the Bill of Rights, which is currently on its way through Parliament, might seek to challenge, or would provide sort of caveats to, basically. So we would still be in the ECHR, but there would be parts of the Bill of Rights that is currently going through Parliament that would kind of look at individual cases and try to kind of change the basis on which a claim could be made. So yeah, that's a live issue at the moment. Yeah, that's it, I'd say.
Great. Thanks, Barney. I suppose I missed out some housekeeping at the top. This is a think-in, like old think-in, so everyone is invited to pitch in on anything at any time. Raise your hand. If there are people online, please, will you keep an eye out and let us know. So I wrote a list of questions, in addition to the one on the screen, that I hope we can get to. Why are the Conservatives so neuralgic about small boats? Why are there small boats? Where do they fit into the bigger picture, as discussed earlier? What is the bigger picture? What is the new policy? Does it work? Is it fair? Can it last? And what about the ECHR? Let's start with small boats. Dave, I want to come to you in a minute, but first, Matt, can we get Matt and Mike just on the politics of that first question? Why is this government so neuralgic, given what Barney's shown us about the relative smallness of the numbers?
Well, it's not neuralgic, it's delighted, in the sense that, to offer a bit of background, the issue of small boats or refugee vessels crossing the channel illegally has been an issue for a long time. I mean, John Reid, when he was New Labour Home Secretary in the, I think, 2006-7, was quite vocal about this. But it became a sort of frontline political issue when Priti Patel was at the Home Office, and she militarised it, bringing the Royal Navy in. But it has become really prominent under Rishi Sunak, and there are specific reasons to that. I wrote a column last year comparing it, saying that small boats are to Sunak as the wall was to Trump, in that specifically Sunak obviously is basing his hopes of winning the next election upon economic competence, economic recovery. But there's been in number 10 an understanding that the coalition that Boris Johnson built, the electoral coalition in 2019, that delivered an 80-seat majority, is already fragmenting. So what do you add to the economic, very hard haul that Sunak and Hunt have embarked upon? And the decision was taken that it had to be something that involved social conservatism, that would appeal to the so-called red wall voters, but also it had to be something quite specific and small and identifiable. And I think it's no accident small boats like sleaze or spin are words that fit into a tabloid headline. They're very friendly in that regard, and that it was something that he could talk about all the time. And I was told by someone in Downing Street that it goes through the roof. People love this. They love Rwanda and small boats, voters, that is.
In focus groups run by Downing Street.
Yeah. And so, whereas I suspect most people in this room, maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect that most people in this room would probably be against the Rwanda deportation scheme and against the kind of zealous emphasis upon small boats. That is not wholly typical of the electorate. And so what you've really got is a performative policy, because the argument of the government is, oh, this is going to be a fantastic deterrent. Well, actually, if you dig into deterrent psychology, which there's been a lot of work.
Sorry, when you say this is going to be a fantastic deterrent, you mean the announcement of a policy that...
Yes, going after small boats will make refugees stop at Calais and say, oh, let's turn back, folks, this looks terrible. Actually, deterrence only works when it, as a strategy, if it's visibly working in practice. All the criminologist studies show this. You imagine the average refugee arriving in northern France after perhaps being on foot or after horribly traumatic experiences, health difficulties, bereavement, God knows what. The idea that they're going to see the cliffs of Dover and go, oh, that looks a bit scary, I'm not going to get into a dinghy and go over, is, common sense tells you that's ridiculous. But also history and example, precedent shows it's a ridiculous thing. However, the cynicism at the heart of all this is that they don't really care. The point is just to keep going on about it. They've only got to get to 2024, the government. And it plays so well as an intention to stop these boats and then those that do get over to fly them back to Rwanda or to fly them to Rwanda, that the success rate is secondary. And I've heard this described as track B. If the economy is track A, this is track B. It's very specific, it's very performative, but it generates a huge amount of media coverage, as we've seen, and it makes Sunak look like a tough guy. It gives him a sort of butch aura, well, that's the theory anyway, in addition to his kind of technocratic, FT reading, former Goldman Sachs personality.
But Matt, isn't the narrative in the Mail, as long as the numbers go up or stay high, one of failure on his part?
Yes, but a heroic failure, because I'm.
Oh, and blame it on the French.
I don't agree with any of this, but I think that in the time frame we're talking about, and it may not work, but the strategy is we just keep going at it. Mm-hmm. And people will understand that our intentions are the right ones, that are in mesh with what they think perhaps privately and are not able to feel they aren't able to voice. So there's a very political dimension to this. Obviously, there's a huge policy dimension to it, which we can go on and talk about. But in answer to the question on the screens, that's why.
Right. Okay. Jane. Yes, let's get Jane a mic. No, you do, because there are people in Ashby de la Zouch who want to hear you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something about the visual element to all of this. That's such a massive part of it, isn't it? Because before we couldn't visualise, what immigration was. You might have seen refugee camps or something like that. But now we're seeing little boats. There's really, human interest stories in there. It's very emotive, and. I think, the pictures make it very real for everyone. It's kind of looks like Dunkirk, doesn't it? That in people's heads.
And by Matt's analysis, it is fortunate, not unfortunate for the government that numbers have gone up. But do we know why the numbers have been going up so steeply this year? Phoebe and then Mark, yeah? So you have to do two things at once: talk and
This is more of a question, but like I would assume that obviously we didn't see pictures of people in lorries in the same way we see pictures of people in
Right.
boats, and obviously the quantity of lorries that come over from the channel. And maybe Dave would be better to speak to us in terms of work we've done on that. But that was my kind of understanding. I don't know necessarily about this year, although I can imagine the kind of deterrent policies done and Rwanda have done the opposite in terms of pushing people to go now rather than later. But obviously there's other reasons why that might have been. But in terms of, we didn't hear about small lorries. That doesn't mean that those people haven't then been displaced. And I've not seen an accurate description of how many people were in lorries who are now going onto boats and how much Calais has affected that as well.
Right. Yeah. We do. What we do know is that there was an effective crackdown at Sangatte, basically. Right. Yeah. Okay. Mark. And sorry, I'm keeping you waiting, Dave.
So there was a story recently, because it's not peculiarly a Channel Britain story. They have the same issue. Spain has the same issue with the Canary Islands, which has skyrocketed in the last couple of years. So there was something like 10,000 individuals attempted to cross if you think the Channel's dangerous, the Atlantic Ocean from the west of Africa to the Canary Islands is really treacherous. It's about 6 days. And it was something like, I don't know, a third increase on previous years. And that was put down to, in the last year, that was put down to food shortages and things caused by supply chain problems caused by Ukraine. To your question about what caused it. So for that particular part of the world, for people moving across to get into Spain, incidentally, they have the same problems. The Spanish authorities are having exactly the same problems that the English authorities are having, whereby people are housed in, people who enter the system are housed in substandard conditions. There's a place in Gran Canaria called the Port of Shame, has become known as, because of the poor state of accommodation for the people that get trapped in the system, and Spain is maintaining quite a vigorous approach to the whole blockade, deport approach that we sort of seem to try and have as well. But I just thought it was interesting.
So they're trying to do the same thing?
They're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to sort of maintain a strict kind of wall and maintain an outpost at the frontier. So whereas ours was sort of Calais,
That's hundreds
Dover.
of miles of West African coast.
Yeah, but they're maintaining that they've created like this sort of holding pen at the frontier between West Africa and Spain, which is the Canary Islands, and they're trying to sort of contain it all there in that spot and push people back to where they came from with deportation flights.
Is there an equivalent political debate about wrestling with the ECHR about the legality of arriving as a quote-unquote illegal asylum seeker?
I think so. I mean, alarm bells have been rung by all the same sorts of organisations that are ringing alarm bells here. So Migration Watch and all, International Migration Observatory, all those sorts of people have voiced very similar concerns about the Spanish operation than us, as us.
And of course, you see kind of equivalent things happening in Ceuta and Melilla or whatever it is. Yeah. Zav.
Oh, thank you. It was just to try to answer your question as to why there's now so many people trying to make the crossing. So I think in one regard, Phoebe's right about the lorries. So I think when the pandemic happened and lorry travel and train travel dried up, I think that's when you saw the small boats start to ramp up as a way of getting here. Mm-hmm. And you would imagine that even though the pandemic, is not necessarily affecting lorry journeys now, by that stage you've created a new economy, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's not just going to kind of unwind the day that the world starts.
The trafficker economy.
Pardon?
The trafficker economy.
I think the particular economy around small boats from France to the UK. I think another way of answering the question is looking at who is coming on those boats. So I know last year there were a lot of people from Afghanistan, and obviously it shows an enormous failure of the asylum system. That's a country which Britain has kind of promised a lot to. Even people from that country are having to make these dangerous crossings because Britain is incapable of resettling more than basically half a dozen Afghan asylum seekers, which I think is the number at the moment. And I think
Wait, what was that number again?
I think it's 4. I think it's 4 Afghan asylum seekers have been resettled in the UK.
4.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the number. And in the first half of last year, 18% of the people on small boats were from Afghanistan. So Afghanistan and Albania were the 2 biggest groups.
4 out of roughly how many have landed from Afghanistan?
Oh, well, I don't know if the 4 who've been resettled are people who came on small boats. I think the overall number, as far as I'm aware, I think the overall number is 4. Although if someone,
the schemes, the resettlement scheme,
yeah,
like a difference in that.
but clearly the point is that you're someone from Afghanistan and you're making this illegal journey when you are supposed to be one of the countries that the UK has more of a willingness to kind of help people from. Obviously the UK left the EU, and they did so with this kind of idea of taking back sovereignty, but it meant that they left agreements with the EU where, if you were someone who had already resettled in a different country in the EU, you weren't able to come to the UK, you could be deported, and they've tried to replace it with Rwanda. And if you are someone who's desperate to come to the UK, I'm not sure if you would be particularly deterred by Rwanda, because the attempt to make that scheme happen has been such a failure and keeps getting blocked up in the courts.
Okay. So I'm still confused about the uptick. Well, I suppose the question that I still want to get an answer to relates to that 72% figure. 72% of asylum cases in which a decision is made are positive. The claimant is allowed to stay. But Barney, you made the point that the number, because of the choke, the number that reached that point is very low. And does anybody know whether amongst those seeking to cross on small boats, there is a grapevine, there's scuttlebutt about that 72% number, and is that a pull factor? Or is the scuttlebutt, no, when you get over there, if you're lucky, you'll get into the system and you'll be stuck in it, even if you're lucky, for years. And despite that, and despite the danger of crossing, people still get into small boats. That's what I'm confused about. Dave's smiling, so I'm going to let Dave talk now.
I mean, a lot of that is impossible to answer, isn't it? But clearly there are pull factors that make the UK attractive that aren't about, getting a council house or getting benefits. People, as a legacy of our role in the world, lots of nationalities have established migrant groups here, and so there are relatives and there are communities that people are drawn to for completely understandable reasons that aren't relevant elsewhere. There is still a prevailing view, perhaps, that that Britain is a rules-based society, and so people are drawn to the idea that they might be fairly treated if they get here. And clearly, there's with the financed transportation of people, asylum seekers across Europe, lots of people don't actually know where they're heading for. They might pay money in a what you think of as a transit country and don't know where they're ending up, and they'll find themselves being tipped out of a vehicle in Calais, and then the next step is that they are put into the hands of organised people smuggling. And the argument is that the British government has created the business model for the smugglers because there's a decade of intensified security around the Sangatte area, around the Channel ports. So whereas it was easy to jump in the back of a lorry 10 years ago, it's probably virtually impossible today, and so there is only one area of vulnerability, which is a small boat on a beach, because it's hard to police that whole coastline.
But one thing everybody who gets in a small boat on the North French coast has in common is that they've opted to do that rather than apply for asylum in France. But what you're saying is, in many, if not most cases, that was never something they considered anyway. Is that correct?
Well, I must admit I don't know the figures that relate to asylum applications inside of France, but there are many thousands of people who do claim asylum in France, who are going nowhere near the Channel.
Right, as I suppose that slide showed.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, clearly, the starting point for this is the number of asylum cases that the UK deals with is numerically much smaller than a lot of Europe, and per head of population is way smaller than Germany, Spain, France, Italy.
Yeah. Now, Dave, we were talking earlier about you've been talking to Liberty Investigates.
Yeah.
Why, and what are they up to?
Well, I think so. They've got quite an interesting project on the go, and it's still in the works. But I think essentially what they're trying to establish is whether or not the UK failed or ignored its legal responsibilities when it comes to the terms of engagement for accidents at sea, what the conventions are to respond to vessels in distress, and they've managed to get some really good data out of FOIs of the UK Coast Guard, most of it dragged out. But they've looked particularly around November 24th, 2021, which is the worst disaster in modern times, when 27 people died in one boat, and it was a particularly busy month. And so the question I suppose they're looking at is, was this an unforeseen disaster, or was it a highly predictable event? And they've looked at they've managed to get data for something like the 4 busiest days leading up to that date, and established that there are 54 cases, according to internal documents, where the Coast Guard didn't send what they call assets, in other words, boats, to a notification of distress. And then of those, there's certainly they've tracked it against a different maritime database where they can show that 17 boats, there was no response from anybody within 4 hours, and there were at least 300 people involved in those particular boats. And so the question I suppose they're trying to answer is, what's the reason that we didn't respond? And you would think the answer to that is either there was a direct policy imperative, or there was a shortage of resource, or there was poor management in the moment. And it looks like they've, I think the one, you might not be surprised, they've tried to get the data for the 24th of November, and it's all been redacted or refused. And because the British government's rather hiding behind a marine accident investigation, ongoing inquiry into those deaths.
Which doesn't protect them on the other days because there weren't accidents.
Or
because people didn't die.
Seemingly they've decided it's not quite as sensitive on the other days, and so they've willingly, or rather reluctantly, put out some of the data. But so I suppose the question is really like, well, one thing I was just going to add was there's one line in media which suggests that there were 10 people on duty at Dover Coast Guard on the night of the 24th, and they've actually just obtained some new information which shows there were only 2 people on duty on the night in question. So you just have the sense that there is a bad story that the British government in its various forms is very reluctant to get out there or allow out there. And much more data has come from the French side of things about that disaster, transcripts, and a timeline of where the boat was at given moments. So I'd say it's a long-winded way of saying I'm really fascinated to know, are we fulfilling our humanitarian responsibility in the Channel? I think the answer can be said to be measurably no. And that seems a big deal to me.
Yeah. James, I'll come to you in a second, and Liz. Well, heck, let's do it, James and then Liz, instead of me rabbiting on.
Liz?
Thanks. If we're trying to answer why did small boats become such a big issue, and why are they still such a big issue, at least in terms of how this government is tackling what it sees as the big issues, the answer I think lies in the polling, which is that fewer than 2 in 5 of voters who voted for the Tories in 2019 intend to vote for them again at the next election. But only 1 in 6 of those voters plan to switch to Labour. A huge chunk of them say they don't know how they'll vote or plan to vote for a different party or say they won't vote. Because these people, though they're disillusioned with the current Tory government, do not want a country run by the Labour Party. They don't want a more liberal, progressive country, a country which they perceive will be run by a government which is less tough on crime, softer on things like immigration. They want tougher borders, tougher law and order, etc. And so in order to double down and win those voters, Sunak is going to keep concentrating on this as an issue. And in the background to all this is the spectre of Nigel Farage, really, because he hasn't been present in politics for the last couple of years. But the Reform Party is polling. It's jumped up in the polls from 3 to 7%, led by the pretty anonymous Richard Tice. If Farage, who is, in terms of what he's achieved in terms of getting the country to vote for Brexit, taking it from a fringe issue to being front and centre of UK policy, returns to the fray, that could seriously split the Tory vote in a number of constituencies where these voters live, and thereby lead to a bigger Labour majority at the next election. So they're kind of betting the house on this in terms of trying to win back those voters and keep the ones who haven't turned away from them.
So that supports what Matt was saying, reinforces the argument to continue looking tough, and it would suit them if the numbers stayed high.
Indeed.
Amrit, we'll come to you in a second. Liz?
Well, I'm a lefty progressive, and thank you for invoking the spectre of Farage, as you call him. Because in that 504 figure, 504,000 net migration, if I understand that figure properly, there's 2 ingredients in that number. One is how many people arrive, the immigration that everybody's frightened of, and one is how many people leave, which is the number that nobody ever talks about. Yeah. I'm really interested in the people who go the other way, because as and when, a bunch of naive and possibly obnoxious people get together and do Project Rejoin, I'm really here for that.
So I think, as a discussion group.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm really interested in who left, and I think that you could. I don't know if that data exists. What's the composite calibre, flavour of those people who have gone since 2016? Knowing what we know about skills gaps, NHS vacancies and everything else. And how do you piece together something really simple and gettable that can play to your bunch of undecideds that says, this is what happens when you try and take back control and it fails miserably?
Who left?
I don't know what we know. Who's gone?
Well, Barney, we'll come to you. Just in your, do you know if Phoebe, do you know if the Migration Observatory kind of analyses those leaving by what they do and who they are?
I'd imagine they don't, but I'm not sure.
They don't?
Yeah. I imagine it would be immigration to Britain that they would look at rather than people leaving.
Okay.
The census data will be up to I know that's 2010 to 2021.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Who's gone? Amrit.
Yeah, so it's actually just a little bit on the back of what Liz was saying around the numbers. I'm really interested to know what the numbers were, how many boats are coming across before it actually became a big thing. Because like, if the numbers were essentially the same, then it's very much a culture war thing that's been going on now. Someone's picked up on the fact that we've got X thousand boats coming across. Let's make it an issue for people to get riled up about.
Well, we know that the numbers coming in small boats have gone up steeply. Your point is, if you add, is it have they merely moved from trucks to boats?
Well, yeah, it's a combination of two things. How many boats are actually coming across before it came into the public consciousness, and then what percentage of the overall migration were on those boats? Because it may be, it may be something that people have picked up on and gone, actually, we can make a thing of this. Let's rile people up around this nice, easy to easy to articulate topic.
Yeah, well, it seems that is the case. Yeah. Alex.
Well, I think that number was 45,000, so 10%.
Yeah, it's not a huge jump.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and just to, well, I've misunderstood that, but fine.
Well, sorry, just to say that the 504,000 net migration issue is like a conflation. It's not just about asylum. It's about students.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
People on
Students, yeah.
Skilled worker visas. Yeah. So that's a large figure, of which asylum is only a tiny part. And the mode of transport has changed, but really over time, in the last decade or so, the asylum caseload hasn't grown hugely in terms of new arrivals. What has happened is the backlog is growing and has grown hugely because the bureaucratic infrastructure has just decayed. There's nobody actually making the decisions. So I think it's the issue, as others have said, is that the small boats are much more visible than the back of a lorry, and there's almost no route into the UK now to claim asylum other than arriving on the shores.
Yes. Well, Steph, you were first, and then we'll go to the back.
So I just looked on the Migration Observatory website, and their data is suggesting that in 2020, net migration of EU citizens was negative. More EU citizens left the UK than actually arrived here, to the sum of about 94,000 leaving the UK. So that means people just aren't coming in, or weren't in 2020 at least.
And Matt, there's some interesting stuff going on under there, because I was looking at the Bloomberg chart just before this, which shows, I mentioned the Italian thing, right? Spain and Portugal are drifting up. France is down, but it must be substantially down. They must be substantially down from France and elsewhere for that number to be the case, which I don't doubt. That was during... Right.
London's population dropped by like 1 million at one stage.
Right. Okay, but weirdly these lines don't have big kind of... Anyway, sorry, yeah.
Just wanted to add something on what's been said on the bureaucracy side. Just another data point. In the UK in 2021, the average waiting time for applications to be processed was 15.5 months, which is significantly higher than Germany, France, and Austria, for example. And during that waiting time, if I'm not mistaken, people are not allowed to work in the UK, and they can only apply for a job after 12 months of waiting time. And the only job that they can have access to are jobs on the shortage occupation list. And I think this huge backlog that there is probably playing a lot into the difficulty in managing and this being a big issue in the UK right now.
It does feel like we're a country that is always...
Mike.
Sorry, I should put my hand up and join the queue. There's the joke about British people like queuing, but there's people across... I wonder how much waiting is happening. You say 15.5 months for your average application processing response, and then how long it is to have a hip replacement. I bet there's probably quite a fun data visualization about waiting for things. How long it takes to get shit done in this country now. Fucking ages, in summary.
Waiting to get shit done. Imi, and then Joe.
Thank you. Just on that, I'd be interested to know, all of this is reminding me of Amelia Gentleman's book on the Windrush scandal, because you learned quite a lot about, I think there was a processing, I don't know what it's called, but there was a centre in Croydon where she seemed to spend a lot of her time trying to get
Luna
in.
House, right?
Yeah, and trying to find out what's going on there. And I would be interested to learn more about who it is that's processing these asylum claims, how experienced they are, what training they have, and also the targets that they're probably being given by the Tory government, because with Windrush, obviously they set lots of targets there. So what it must be happening here as well, and just finding that out would be interesting.
Yeah. Does anyone know, is all current asylum processing handled in Croydon as well? Luna House is a miserable place. There's a big building in London Bridge as well.
There are caseworkers
all
in
over.
Liverpool.
Yeah.
Glasgow,
Okay.
And there was do you remember Nicola Kelly did that that podcast with us with Jack Schenker on the Home Office recently? She did a great story in November where she said the Home Office was hiring people from like customer service positions at McDonald's and Tesco's to do these cases, and that she managed to find that by following people on LinkedIn and working out what their career trajectory had been. It was pretty dire.
Okay, look, we've got 20 minutes left. Guys, we'll come to you. But two things occur to me. One is that we haven't really moved beyond small boats to the bigger picture, which I wanted to do. And the other is we haven't figured out what stories are the great stories. I mean, where to go next? So I invite you to raise your hands for anything, but also with specific story ideas. I mean, just so far, what I've actually picked out as a story is from, thank you, Dave, what, excuse my French, the fuck happened on the night of the 24th of November 2021. How many were on duty? On what basis are they continuing to decline FOI requests? How high does that go? That is surely a great story. The UK exodus. There's a portal to the bigger picture story. Who's going? What are the labour shortages that the immigration policy is supposed to address, and is it doing that? That's all wonkish. We need to find a sexy, frankly, way into that. Jane that is the kind of hand raising that wants to jump the queue. So let's. Well, we will. So for sheer energy, you get to jump the queue, but she needs a mic, and then Joe, you can stay there and get it off her.
I want to know what's happening in Rwanda. Is anyone actually there yet, and what's happened to them?
Great question. We did. Well, now, where did we leave that? We did the podcast on.
Yeah, and since then, the government won the appeal court hearing, but I think that's still being challenged. And
it's still going back to ECHR.
The answer is none at the moment. Nobody's gone.
But your idea, Jane, you'd secretly or not secretly like someone to go so we can follow them. Yeah. And see if they do what happened before, which is promptly leave or get thrown in jail by the police state, which is Rwanda. Right. Joe.
I feel that there's a sort of core issue that we're kind of overlooking, which is a lot of it is asylum. Is there any actual way that someone can claim asylum these days without jumping in a small boat? I mean, if their target is to claim asylum in the UK, and there's all sorts of reasons why people could and should or shouldn't or whatever claim elsewhere in Europe. We are an island, and perhaps, as Matt and James hinted at, the UK government exploits the fact that we're an island in order to by funneling people to the only route they have to claim asylum in the UK, which is to access the country illegally through a small boat. Used to be done in, a lot of the security around the ports and the Channel Tunnel have been increased to stop people getting into trucks or getting through by getting into trucks. So perhaps there's a bit of manipulation to create a dog whistle effect on the small boats. But the core issue is, how on earth is anyone supposed to claim asylum in the UK if they can't get here without a small boat?
Right, to which the rote answer is safe and legal routes. And Connor, that... what? Yeah, are there any? There was that great exchange between, was it Sir Patrick Lawton, is that his name? And Suella Braverman.
It was Tim Lawton.
Tim Lawton,
About the hypothetical, how would one come from someone in a small African nation and come into the country?
James's question the day after that was it hypothetical? Did anyone find out?
I think it was hypothetical, but so we spoke to someone from the Refugee Council, me and Jess, who's not here today, which is also the point I wanted to raise anyway, which was on kind of specifically young people coming into the country and as a way into it, because their concern, and the Guardian's done some reporting on this, is that in terms of kind of Home Office staff working through the backlog and trying to deal with things so that things like Manson don't happen again, is that if you are particularly boys in the age range of kind of 14 to 18, is to mark you as an adult, because that changes the way that you're put into the system. So rather than going to a local authority and into the care system, which is a longer, more extensive, more time-intensive process, you are put as an adult, and then you are put into one of the many hotels that have kind of become the norm. And even though in some cases some have provided ID, because people do travel with passports and ID with them, it's not counted. And those decisions are being made by Home Office officials in a hotel or wherever they're kind of being held on a, well, I think so, and off you go. But obviously that's a safeguarding issue for them. But I think their point is it raises quite a key question about like the management, like those processes that kind of exist once you get into the country. And I think that's where, there isn't the scrutiny. And Priti Patel was Home Office Minister, but there's been some chop and change and some I think, Dave's podcast is brilliant on exactly how all these kind of interchangeable things and the things that are slipping through the system. But obviously these are all, we're sort of talking numbers, these are individual people who all have very different circumstances, and the system's not really catering for that right now. So yeah, I would really like to follow that up though. I think that would be a really interesting way into the story to tell that side of it specifically.
14 to 18-year-olds marked by officials whose last job might have been at Tesco.
And if you want a big picture thing, I just think that in terms of immigration, I think as 100-year life is my topic, I think immigration will still become increasingly valuable, as you can see from a lot of countries in Asia, in terms of supporting an aging population and also we know like long-term sick populations. You need a working population into the country. And I'm not saying that's people coming illegally, I'm saying that's people and a fund of people as birth rates drop, and this is kind of long-term planning that you're not going to get from this government, but effectively we will need some immigration into the country and able to support everyone getting slowly older and not having as many babies. And yeah, we should remember that.
Yeah. Emma, have you got a mic?
I'd be interested in, none of us can actually answer the question which is why are people coming to the UK? So we've all come up with various, we think it might be, I mean, Dave had some great ones, and it probably is around like them having relatives here, or, could it be because they think they're going to get access to, benefits? Might it be to do with language? I'd be really interesting, if we're talking about human stories, could we reach out to some of these people? Could we get in contact with them and actually ask that question? Why the UK? Why not France? Why not Germany? Why not? Because actually, we're just kind of speculating. The people that will be able to tell us why are the people that are getting on those small boats.
Yeah, good point. Tomini, yes. Katie Riley, are you in the room? She's in a Sky meeting. Katie has experience of the new points-based immigration system. Does anybody else? Because one of the things, you have to pinch yourself. We have left Europe. it is the new policy. It is happening. People are being allowed in or barred entry depending on whether, as Nina put it, they're a refugee or a PhD. Anyway,
Sarah might be able to. I do take
you have experience of the points-based system. Tommy, we will get to you.
That's okay. It was much easier for me than anyone else because I was
Because of your PhD?
Yeah, well, because of my bachelor's degree. So I was immediately awarded the points.
Really?
Yeah, so
wait, you're a US citizen?
Yes. So I went to school in the UK.
Okay.
And there used to be an old policy which they took away for 4 years and now they just brought back so I graduated this year, which is that I was afforded...
Sorry, when you say you went to school, you went to college here?
University.
University, okay.
Yeah,
Did that make a difference?
Yes, it has to be like an accredited 3 or 4 year program with an honors level degree. And so you can apply for a special visa once you prove that you've graduated. That will just let you stay in the UK for 2 years, no matter what. Yeah, but that's it. And then you get a certain number, because you've met the qualification, a certain number of the points are awarded to you, which then makes you eligible for this special visa. If you do a master's or a PhD as well, I think it's the same thing. So even if you're just here for 1 year and you're an international student, you can get that visa as well. And I think if you do a PhD, instead of it being 2 years to stay here, it's 3 years to stay here.
And is that available only to certain people from certain jurisdictions?
I would have to check. So my recollection, I will admit the form was very long, so I don't remember it super well. But I think if you're on a list, it's technically available to any international student. If you're on a list of specific countries, you do one application process, which being from America, I was on that list and it was much easier. And I didn't even have to go into an immigration center. And if you're on a different list, it's a much more extensive process. And I think they actually give you a personal interview to make sure you can qualify for it.
Okay, and that's different from the Golden Talent Visa or something? Yeah.
It's different. Yeah.
And at the end of your 2 years, you have to go, unless you're doing a PhD or something.
I think it gets a little bit tricky. So you can I could try to apply for a skilled worker visa, which is dependent on sponsorship from wherever I'm working.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Tomini.
This may be a question or a subject that has an easy answer, but I'd be interested to know if the government have any plans to up legal aid, because I know that that's a big reason why a lot of lawyers are turning down asylum claims as they're coming. Certainly when I was a paralegal, I had to tell a lot of people, sorry, we can't take on your case right now. We can't take on your case right now.
And these people were asylum seekers in that 15-month limbo?
Yes, yes. So there were a lot of people who had claims already filed that were just waiting and waiting and waiting. And the lawyer was obviously the go-between to say, sorry, the Home Office haven't got back to us yet. We'd chase the Home Office, they'd be like, sorry, you're gonna have to wait a bit longer because we've got a massive backlog. So I don't know if there are any plans to help get the lawyers on side, because obviously legal aid to them is like pittance when they could get £3,000 from someone who can afford it.
So what was the situation when you were a paralegal? How much legal aid was available? How would you measure it in terms of the amount available per claimant?
So I think it was somewhere around the £600 mark per claim, but obviously that the claims took so long to process that for the lawyers it was like more of a headache than anything else. I think there was discussion at the end of last year about increasing it, but I don't think a decision has been come to.
Was it effectively pro bono work by your firm?
Yeah. There was a lot of pro bono work that was also happening.
And are there a lot of asylum seekers who don't have a lawyer at all?
I assume so, if they're being turned down, because that was just the case at the firm I worked at, where they were just like, no, sorry, we don't. At the point on the phone, they were just like, no, we're not taking this on, sorry.
That's a really good question. Okay. Patricia.
Just to Emma's point about why people are coming in, I came across something a while ago that suggested that a lot of the Albanians who are coming in on small boats were being targeted by TikTok ads, who were saying that it's sort of safe, cheap, and reasonably effective to come in the country that way. And on that same call with Phoebe, we spoke to someone at the Refugee Council who said, yeah, that's true, and it's not unique to Albania. A lot of the people who come in through these ads on TikTok, especially young people. So I'm really interested in that, whether it's happening, what role technology plays in this uptake.
So journalistically, could one follow the social media aniseed trail from central Iran to here?
I think that's the question.
And
Who is making these videos and why?
So that's TikTok, and if I'm not mistaken, Facebook is completely essential in the sort of logistics and the organisation. Yeah,
I've heard that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other things was supposed to be.
Give Joe a mic.
I don't have any facts for it, but one of the other things that's supposed to be fueling the Albanian increase is the construction industry and its massive lack of unskilled labour. You can't come into the country unless you qualify for the points-based system with a legal visa from other European countries now, even, but we have this huge deficit in unskilled labour, which can't be filled because our own workforce, or our employment numbers are fairly high domestically. Where is our unskilled labour coming from? And therefore, it opens up to the black market, who will, import people to work on building sites.
And equivalent make-do solutions are going to have to be found in multiple sectors, aren't there? Okay, so 2 minutes to 2. We make podcasts, and most of our podcast makers are, well, you're in the room still. You're in the room still, but a lot. Jasper and Basher have gone off. So the real question is, what do we make a podcast about that touches on immigration? I'm not an expert, but maybe.
Doing it to you, Dave. No, I've spoken a lot. You speak.
Which of these stories? I can't help thinking it's November the 24th, 2021. Sustains 35 minutes of audio, and how do we go about finding the person who can tell that story?
Me, Dave, you've done the work on that one. But there is actually. I mean, I think there's something in that. There's real investigation behind it, and there's some big themes about what kind of country we are. I was just reading something about the Rwanda case, and there were eight cases that formed the case that went to the High Court. And I'm reading something from the Refugee Council that's talking about 193 paragraphs of the judgment on these people, and 7 of them were from Iran and Syria. And in one case, Home Office used evidence from an interview with the wrong person. And in another one, somebody made a judgment where they were relying on the decision of another civil servant who hadn't yet taken the decision. So there's so much to go back over, and it sounds like those 8 cases are being reheard in January. So maybe we should zero in on what happened to the Rwanda policy through the lens of the 8 cases at the centre of it.
Okay.
You could also do that with take one vote. Take one vote and find out exactly what happened to all the different people on it.
Yeah. It's a great idea. Okay. So let's leave it like this. So that this isn't just going through the motions and saying that we're going to talk. So if anyone has any cracking ideas of that sort of specificity to help us cover this subject, well, don't just sit on it. Send an email to me or Dave or Basher or Liz or all Tortoise. But I've got inside the Rwanda fiasco, inside November the 24th, 2021, a graphic on the British mega queue. I'm not quite sure how we do that, but it would be fun. We could do, that's definitely a sense maker special territory. Take one boat. Who's doing the processing and where and how and to what targets? That's a bit mushy, but I agree that there's a question there. Is it Lunar House? What's it like in the cockpit? And the Exodus. Again, mushy but important, so we need to pull it into focus. It's probably my fault that it's mushy. But I think that's progress. I feel I've got further beyond where we were at 1 o'clock. So thanks very much, everyone. Have some lunch.